I am the chess strategist, and today we're going to win another chess game. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our chess rapid speed run. In our last video, we did play some puzzles. We improved. We talked about calculation and just making proper moves in different positions. And today we're going to resume our rapid speed run. I'm super excited to get into it, so let's just get right into it, guys. And yeah, we are starting to get some opponents that are, they know the openings, they know what they're doing, they're not playing stupid moves, and we are able to have some really complex, interesting games. And we get the white pieces, and we start with the white against Reginwald Porn. Very interesting name, okay. And we are going to be playing e4. And our opponent goes for the Sicilian c5. And we're going to go for our the opening we like to go for against the Sicilian pretty much all the time is the Alpin Sicilian, the c3 Sicilian. C3 Sicilian is a very, very powerful opening, and it creates a lot of uncomfortability for your opponents. Okay, so our opponent plays this immediate e5, trying to disallow d4, but he has created a huge weakness in the center of the board here. We're going to just develop our knight with tempo and attack the pawn. And our opponent defends the pawn, of course. And here we need to find a way to attack these pawns, and we need to find a way to put a knight on a square where it can occupy this square eventually. This is a weak square that he's just created with e5. Dangerously weak square. So we don't want to play c4 and give him an equalized weakness in the center of the board. We want to try to reroute our knight if possible. Probably like this. This is a way to reroute our knight. But let's just develop our bishop first. Our bishop could go out to a square where it is exerting control. And if we take this knight, we can win this pawn for free. Okay, so our opponent plays d6 to defend the pawn. Makes sense. And we can start developing our pieces here. I really like the idea of just castling. Nice, and our opponent develops his bishop. And here we have a few different moves. One move I like is just playing d3, opening up our bishop, and opening up another square for our knight to use. And here we're not scared of the bishop taking. We can develop our queen, get it to a nice active diagonal here. Now we have to be careful. If we play this move bishop c4, our opponent may expand with b5, and if we expand with b5, we go here. They're gonna allow them to expand with a lot of tempo. Granted, they can do the same thing if they want to expand with tempo. If we play the move bishop a5, so it really is a preference of where we like our bishop. Our bishop can go occupy this lovely outpost if we do bishop c4. So I am going to go for bishop c4. I like bishop c4 for a few different reasons. He can play b5, but we can occupy d5 if our opponent does that. d5 will be an incredibly weak square. And here he's playing knight here, and then he's going to play b5, which makes sense. I think that's probably a very prudent idea, very good option for him. We are going to see if he goes for it, and he goes for the exchange. He gives us his light square bishop. So he gives us the bishop pair. We have this strong bishop pair now that we can exploit. And I'm really starting to like our position. Now we have a few different ideas. First of all, we want to get this bishop developed to a nice active square. That's the first thing we want to do. The other thing is we want to get this knight so it can start to occupy and control this square. So where can this knight control that square from? Well, there's a few different places. The main square I'm thinking of is e3 though. e3 is the square where we want this knight. So first thing I want to do is develop this bishop. I don't really see where else it could go where it would be active other than onto this g5 square. And whenever you have a piece hanging like this, you need to, it's not hanging, but it's being blocked for now. But if this was out of the way, this would be hanging. You have to be careful. This knight cannot move with tempo. And here our opponent is allowing us to just... We're going to drop our bishop back. And can they go for this advance? Well, you have to check. If they advance, we will take, and they'll take, and they'll take, and we'll have won a pawn. So it's really really nice to notice stuff like that in the position. Our opponent wants to exchange this knight for this bishop, and we do not want to give up this bishop. This bishop is the strongest piece we have, and we can redeploy it along this diagonal. Eventually, his knight has been forced to go to the side of the board, and that's just not good. Now here we have this tactical idea, and this is the idea of weak squares. This is the weak square in his position. He doesn't have a light square bishop to defend that square anymore, but he does have a knight. A knight can defend all the different squares on the board. So what we're going to do here is we're going to exchange our dark square bishop for his knight, because our dark square bishop is very weak. It's not controlling very many squares. His dark square bishop cannot control this light square. So now we're going to just use our knight, and we're going to reroute it to that square, and we're going to have an excellent knight in the center of the board that our opponent cannot contest. First thing we're going to do is develop our rook. There's many squares you can put our rook. I like e1. E1 is just a nice square. And see, our opponent doesn't really have strongly developed pieces, but he does have weaknesses already in the center of the board. He's developed his queen to an interesting square. He still hasn't castled his king at all. His king is just kind of in the center of the board. We're going to reroute our knight. Now, our knight was going to go rerouting like this, but now we see a different path that opens up a lot in the Italian opening, where you reroute your knight from d2 to f1, and then it goes to e3. And our knight is going to try to get to that square as fast as possible. This square, again, when two pawns have advanced past the square, or on the same file as the square, you start to see that there's nothing that can defend that square except for pieces. The pawns cannot restrict that square. And our opponent is starting to realize, shit, I need to trade off the knight as fast as possible. So he's decided that he wants to trade the bishop for the knight. He's put this bishop on this diagonal. And yeah, and he's just opened up the file for us. Now our opponent has transformed the advantage. Here we are playing a lot more interesting chess. Now let's see. We can take and allow his knight to go onto that square, but I don't want to allow that. We can also strike with this interesting move b5, where he is allowed to take en passant, but he opens up or b4, sorry, not b5. He opens up our rook. So I'm just going to strike with this move. We allow him to take en passant, but we keep our pawns in the center, and we open up our rook, and we open up these weak pawns for influence. Also, it attacks his knight, so he's going to have to make a move. He's going to have to play en passant, or he's going to have to move his knight. And he does move his knight, which is excellent. Now his knight is on a very well-restricted square. The square is not going anywhere. This pawn is restricting him from going here and here. And now here, he can't go here, can't go here. Okay, so his knight is now poorly placed. Okay. And I'm just going to take here. I'm just going to take, isolate his pawns, create another weakness so we can attack. I'm just going to put my rook on the center of the board as well. And there's another weak pawn here we can attack. There's a weak pawn here we can attack. There's all sorts of weak pawns in this position. This bishop is going to be developed to a much stronger diagonal eventually. If we go here, how is he going to defend this pawn? Our queen wasn't really doing much attacking this pawn. It's now well defended by the rook, and it's on the same line, so we don't want to allow him to play something move like f5 with tempo, trying to expose the attack on our queen. We don't want to allow that, so we move our queen, we attack a weak pawn, and if he allows us to take this pawn, we have certain follow-up moves, such as bishop to a4, which is a move I've been eyeing here, pinning the knight to the queen. Our opponent chooses, he wants to attack our pieces with tempo, so he's probably going to, if we take the pawn here, he's going to develop his rook to the c file and try to get a more interesting control over that square. And I'm not really too concerned. We can drop our queen back, and we'll still have strong influence over this square. We also put our queen here and create an attack on this pawn. So yeah, it looks like we're starting to get a control over the position. Our opponent has a lot of weak pawns. He has this weak pawn here. He has this weak pawn here, which is a backwards pawn. Backwards pawn is a pawn that is usually, first of all, it's weak. There's no other pawns behind it defending it. And second of all, we have a pawn here that's restricting its advance. It cannot advance without being taken. So we have decided that is just, we're not going to allow our opponent to have that. And here our opponent advances his pawn to a5, attacking our pawn on b4. We can take, of course, but we should probably calculate first. Calculate taking. So if we take here, he takes, and then he takes, or he can take this pawn. So we don't want to allow any of that. We can just take, we can advance our pawn here to defend. And he's giving us a fast pawn on the side of the board as well, which we can start pushing. We have this strong square to occupy, and we have this knight, which has been temporarily restricted by his bishop, but we're going to be able to deal with this bishop. We're going to be able to reroute our knight. Eventually, our knight might end up going to this f5 square because our opponent is restricting us from using this e3 square that we really wanted to use. But notice here, our opponent's pieces are very poorly developed. His queen is not active. His rooks are on these open files, creating some pressure. But this pawn isn't that weak. Why? Because it can advance. And our opponent proposes a take back. It looks like he blundered his rook. We're going to be nice to him, and we're going to allow him to get the take back. He blundered a rook, and usually we don't allow that, but we're going to allow him to have the take back, and because that's just an anticlimactic way to end the game. We have a strong position here. We don't need the luxuries of a lot of letting him blunder like that. I'm sure it was a misclick. Okay, and he puts his rook here. He wants to defend. He also might want to advance and advance his pawn and desecrate his weakness that he has at the center of the board. Well, we want to start developing our pieces more actively. I think our bishop has done its time on this square. It's not really doing much. So what we can do is just develop our bishop to b3, back to this diagonal where it's creating a lot of pressure against the king, and it's also controlling this key d5 square. This is the key square in the position, along with f5. These are the squares that we're controlling. If our opponent is allowed to play d5 and desecrate their weakness on the square, then we are going to be kind of suffering. That they're going to get some equality back. Granted, we still are going to be up a pawn, but we don't want to allow anything like that. Here, opponent develops his rook, creating more pressure along this diagonal, or this file on our queen. We have to be very careful. And here he's decided to develop his knight. I think his knight wants to go to one of these two squares. We don't want to allow his knight to advance, so we're going to just play this move g3, which is a move I've been thinking about playing for a while. g3 is an interesting move because it's going to allow us to play h4 whenever we would like, and it does blunder a pawn, actually. That is very poor of me. Hopefully our opponent doesn't see that. Very poor move on my part. Okay, and our opponent goes for doubling up his rooks. And here, I think before I forget, before I make another blunder, I am going to just play h4. Okay. And here I could see an opportunity to move our queen with tempo. We have a few different ideas here. One of them being we could put this bishop on this lovely square in the center of the board. We could also put our queen there and threaten a strong attack on this pawn that must be defended. He's going to have to move this bishop again, or move a piece to defend this pawn. I like moving this bishop here, creating a very tangible threat against the pawn here. Move this bishop to the center of the board. Allow it to become the strongest piece we have. I mean, look at it. It's just crisscrossing the board, creating all sorts of pressure, controlling as many diagonals as possible. This is an excellent piece. Our queen can lift itself over to f3, create pressure along the file. And notice I did have the option of putting my queen here, creating an immediate threat here, but we weren't actually creating any threat that he has to respond to immediately except for the one on here. So he could just move his bishop, reroute it to a square that's better anyways. He could move his queen up here. There's a bunch of different moves he could do that would just defend the pawn, or he could just develop his rook back here. So we don't want to allow him to just make good moves for no reason. We would like him to have to make poor moves to defend. Here our queen gets to a nice file, and our rooks are going to start coming into the game here very soon as well. Here our opponent sacrifices his bishop. Okay. Very interesting, and our king has become a lot more weakened because of this move, but still not very much worried. We have a very strong position here. His knight is not hanging. He's going to have to respond. And his knight really doesn't have much places or many places to go. That is his only move. If he was to drop his knight back, we could just take because of the pin. Here I'm just noticing we should probably try to exchange knights. That's probably the best course of action here. As well, I'm also noticing this forkable square, which could be interesting to get try to get our knight to that square. It could fork the king and the queen and just win the game. So I want to just develop our pieces. Our knight has been kind of dormant for a while, and that's mainly because we have just not been able to develop it to a square that we really needed it to go to because of the bishop. Now the bishop's gone. We have our bishop in the center of the board, and we're just going to be able to develop our pieces a lot more strongly. Okay, opponent has moved his king to defend the square, and he's made this f5 advance. We are just going to take. And we are going to drop our knight back, attacking the queen. Our knight has made it now to this e3 square. The square that we wanted it to go to for the longest time has now finally been achieved. And his king is starting to be very weak. Very, very weak king. Exploitable. This pawn is going to start advancing. We're going to have passed pawns on sides of the board. This is going to be an interesting game here. Alright, and our opponent has offered a trade of queens. Should we accept is the question. Now, if we take, he's going to take back with one of his pawns, and we're going to have to move our knight. I'm thinking we're up a bishop for a pawn. We should most certainly trade queens. Here we can drop our knight back so we don't lose this pawn. This pawn is now defended, and we're going to just start advancing our pass pawn. We have a pass pawn. Our opponent has one pass pawn over here, but our king is in prime position to defend against that. Here it looks like our opponent has blundered a pawn. He's blundered his pawn over here. He's allowed us to play this nice move, rook e6 with check. We have these two pawns we can take. I think, well, if we take this pawn, I think this pawn is probably easier to defend with this king move over here. So we're just going to, if we go like this, he can walk over. So we're actually just going to take over here. And notice we are getting pretty low on time. This bishop can be defended very easily with the move c4. And notice how this bishop is really restricting the opponent's knight. Opponent has a very weak pawn here that's being blockaded by our nice bishop. We're going to be able to start advancing our pawn here. And, yeah, our opponent decides he wants to attack our piece here. Our king, we're just going to move our king over to f1, square. Probably just wanted to go to anyways. We don't want to exchange our bishop for the knight. The knight is not nearly as strong as our bishop. And now he doesn't have a passed pawn over here. We don't have to worry about him doing any sort of shenanigans with the passed pawn. And here we can just start advancing. Advancing our passed pawn. We want to get it to this checkpoint square on b7 where it's going to be protected by our bishop. And our opponent's just covering holes in his position. Alright, so it looks like we just want to step our king over here. If we went here, he could go back. If we went here, he could go back too. We don't want to allow him checks. We want to think about where our king wants to be. Our king wants to be here defending against these pawns that may advance. We don't want to allow him to get all these strong passed pawns. We want our king to be defending. So our king is going to be a defender. Here we just keep advancing our pawn. Our agenda is stronger than our opponent's, and our opponent hasn't responded to our agenda yet. So we are going to just continue with our agenda. Our opponent is going to realize that, hey, I don't really have anything going for me on this side of the board. I don't have a passed pawn. I don't have any weak squares that I can exploit. He doesn't really have very much going here, so we're not worried. Here we can just move our king back. And our opponent doesn't have any checks that he can give. We're just going to move our king to g1 where it's going to defend pretty brilliantly, I would say. Our king is going to be pretty excellently placed. Also, he's now weakened this square eternally. This e3 square is going to be the square for our knight. Our knight will go to this square. And here our opponent is threatening to play this move rook to e1, which is going to be dangerous. We don't want to allow anything like that. So we're just going to move our knight here to e3, and we're going to open up our rook along this file to defend the square if we have to. And yeah, this knight is now an excellently placed piece, and we are going to have some moves to make. Our opponent looks like he blunders a rook here, and we are not going to allow him to have the take back. We are just going to take. We gave him one take back. Take backs are pretty rare, and our opponent does resign now. So yeah, we got a very interesting endgame here. Our opponent decided to exchange his queens off, and he might have regretted it. I think he shouldn't have exchanged into an endgame. I think his chances were much better with queens on the board, where our king was very weak, and he could have definitely exploited our weakened king and created an attack, and that was his best chance. But we were winning the game. I think he did make some very positional errors, and he was forced to cover up those positional weaknesses. So let's get right into it. We played e4, opponent played c5, and we played the Alpine Sicilian. The Alpine Sicilian, there's one really main idea. The main idea is you want to play d4 and have 2 pawns in the center. That is the idea. Now, when your opponent makes a move in the Alpine Sicilian, usually they do something to attack this e4 pawn, because they can't really stop you from playing d4 eventually, but they try to discourage it, and they make other weaknesses. So they usually attack the e4 pawn. So they play knight f6, that's what I play against the Alpine, or they play d5 immediately, attacking this e4 pawn. Those are the 2 main moves. There's a few other moves, like the one we saw, which was e5. Now, e5 does temporarily make d4 impossible, but it does something much more costly in the long term. And as we saw, this square, d5, was weak the entire game. Our opponent had to defend this square with all his pieces, and we got to play very positionally. We exchanged pieces so that we could have more control over the square. And eventually, when we did get a bishop to this square, was it the most powerful piece on the board? Yes. It was the strongest piece on the board. It had excellent control over all of these diagonals. And if we had a knight on the square, it would have been just as powerful. Knight's controlling all of these squares here, exerting so much control over the board, and our opponent was going to have a very hard time not getting checkmated or losing pieces. So we are very happy to see a move like this, even though it does restrict our ideas temporarily. We get to just develop our pieces, and we have an active plan. We have a plan. Get a knight to this square. That was the plan. And eventually, we weren't able to get a knight to the square, but we decided, hey, our bishop is just as good on the square, and we got our bishop there. So we develop our pieces here. We're noticing that if we do take, we are going to be able to win the pawn. So our opponent correctly defends his pawn in the center of the board. We castle, and we get our king away from the center of the board, which opens up the idea of just playing d5 and sacrificing, playing d4 and sacrificing a pawn at any of these moments. Since the king is in the center, and if we got our rook to e1, we could just advance. It's alright. I don't know what's going on with my... Oh yeah, it's not our move, duh. We could just advance and take, and, you know, if this knight wasn't pinned, we'd be able to take, and we'd open up the center of the board, we could advance our pawn, and we have a strong attack on his king. But I wanted to play this more positionally. We didn't go for anything like that. So we played d3 so we can develop our bishop. He knocks our bishop away. And I talked about the differences between bishop c4 and bishop a5. Bishop c4 I thought was good because it might allow us to get to d5 quicker. But our opponent, he makes a very cautious, careful move, knight f6, which is an excellent move. I think it was probably the best move in the position. What he's trying to do is he doesn't want to play b5 on this turn because we can go to d5. And then we're creating an attack against the knight, and he has to respond to that. Instead, he plays knight f6 first to restrict us from going to this square, and then he's going to exchange pieces, and eventually he'll play b5. And he played b5 here. We dropped our bishop back, and he pursued our bishop with knight to a5, which is usually a very good move to pursue the bishop. But we do have the retreat square on c2 that we created with c3, of course. So we have this nice square, and this square is just a temporary shelter zone for our bishop. It's going to be redeployed to this diagonal almost certainly. So we're just trying to see what our opponent's going to do, and we want to redeploy the bishop eventually. So he knocks away our bishop, and I notice here, you know, usually you don't want to trade the bishop pair off. We have the bishop pair, 2 bishops against only 1. But here I noticed that the control of the dark squares is not that important to us. Our opponent's pawns are all on dark squares in the center of the board, and they're restricting our bishop's activity a lot. This bishop is not going to have a lot of potential to become a great piece. Our great pieces are our knights when they get to these squares, and our bishop controlling all these weak light squares in the position. So these are the pieces that we want to keep. And we notice that his knight, while it's not a great piece, it is defending these key light squares that we want to attack. So we can exchange our dark square bishop for his knight and relinquish some of his control over these light squares, and now he only has one piece that he can attack the light squares with, and we have two, which gives us a large advantage and control over this d5 square. Of course, you could use a rook or a queen or whatever, but this is a very secluded square. You're only going to get a bishop or a knight to defend this square, maybe a queen, but a queen is not a great defender. And we develop our rook. Of course, the main idea is we want to develop this knight now this way, because this knight is not going to get anywhere because our bishop is using the transposition square on c2. So we develop, and he puts his bishop on a nice square, restricting our advance to e3. And of course, there's this other reroute that we could do to f5, but I'm not so concerned about it. It's just not creating that many threats. It creates a threat here, but our opponent could just castle. And here our opponent tries to strike in the center with c4. Now, I didn't like the idea of taking and allowing his knight to come back into the center of the board on a nice active square, creating pressure here. We're going to have to do something like this, or we're going to have to advance the pawn. I don't really want to do that. I don't want to allow his knight to get activity. So we decided to go for a more risky move that creates activity no matter what. And this is b4. Now, opponent can take en passant on this move, from which we would most likely just take with our pawn. And we're creating attack on the knight, and this pawn is going to be weak, and we're going to be able to secure that pawn as a weakness by advancing our pawn to b4. We're going to create this pawn as a permanent weakness. That was the plan if he took en passant. But instead, he drops his knight back, and you see this knight is now kind of a weakened piece. It's not a great piece. It's going to have to go back to e7, where it will be controlling squares. But this pawn is doing a hefty job at restricting the knight, and this pawn too, restricting the knight. This pawn is restricting the knight. So there's a lot that our opponent would like to do, but they can't. And here we take, isolating this pawn. His pawn cannot advance because this pawn's going to be very weak in the center of the board. And of course, the next move we do is immediately we want to restrict it. See, on this move, it actually can't advance. But this move, now there's no way to advance. We just win a pawn, and we're going to have excellent attack on this pawn, and yeah. And now you see our opponent has opened up the file for us. This weakened pawn is becoming a serious weakness. His queen has to defend it. His rook is going to defend it. His bishop would have to defend it. And because there's so many threats, our opponent is considering options like just giving us this pawn. He gives us the pawn. He gets a little bit of development for it. We drop our queen back. We create an attack. We defend our pawns, and we're just playing very patiently. We're not playing for an attack here. We're playing for positional ideas. The positional idea is this pawn is weak. We can attack it. We can use our pieces and develop them onto squares where it's attacking this pawn, and our opponent is going to have to develop his pieces very passively. See, our pieces are attacking, and this rook's attacking. His queen and rook are just defending. They're very weak pieces, so we are just attacking his pieces, and the pressure gets to him eventually. We actually blunder a pawn here. This was my only mistake of the position, really, and he could have taken the pawn. It wouldn't have been the end of the world. His queen is not super well placed on that square. Would have been created a lot of counter threats, but he allows us to advance, and we get our bishop to the center of the board, and here we just create tons of threats. Our opponent sacrifices a piece because he sees no other way to strum up an attack, and he's forced to play this move g5, the only way to save his knight. And we just develop our pieces. We get our knight into the game. We drop our knight back to this e3 square that it's always wanted to go to. And he offers to trade a queens. We drop our knight back temporarily. We need to defend this pawn. We are allowed to win another pawn. He made a blunder there. And we are defend our bishop. Our bishop is now cemented in the center of the board, and there's nothing going to remove it. We move our king over, advance our pawn. We make all these king moves we have to, and our opponent, with this move, f3, gets to knock our king away with tempo, but he does weaken this square permanently, e3, and now e3 is a permanent landing zone for our knight. Our knight is going to be allowed to just sit there. And our opponent, in his disgust, just blunders his rook, and yeah, the game from here would be very clean. We'd be able to advance our pawn to b7. Opponent would have to cover this square. Many different ways he could do it. One of them he would probably do is just rook to b3. But there's many ways for us to contest this rook. There's also just a move like rook to e8, creating another defender on the promotion square, and he's going to have to give up his rook or a knight for this pawn, and we're going to have an overwhelming advantage in pieces. Also here you can see our opponent is almost checkmated. He doesn't have very many squares. This square is taken, all these squares are taken, this square is taken. So if we were able to get our rook to this square, it would be checkmate. And notice here, if we do move our king or our rook over to this square, his king does have this square. And we would be able to repeat, but if we could get our rook to this square, this would just be checkmate. So there's a lot of different ways to win this position, and our opponent didn't see any way forward where he could win, so he resigned. Anyways, guys, I hope you had a really good time watching this video. I had a good time playing it, and our opponent did make some very interesting moves, but we ended up coming out with the win. And I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.